Hi, this is Simon Obstall and welcome to another tutorial for Blender. And today I want to take a look at a compositing setup that's going to allow us to rack focus between the foreground, the middle ground and the background. And it's going to give us some pretty nice bokeh effects along the way. So let's make a start on this. So I've set up my scene with a number of different planes that we can focus on. What I'm going to do is I'm going to render it with cycles, and I'm going to make sure that I have got the Z pass enabled. So let's just quickly render that, and it looks like this. So let's come over to the compositor. Let's just come full screen. Make sure we've got backdrop turned on and use nodes turned on. So what we're going to be doing is using the Z channel and remapping it to create our focal planes. So let's just have a look at the Z pass, add a viewer like that and pipe the Z into it. So you can see very faintly that we've got some sort of depth information here. But what we need to be able to do is we need to remap it, as I say. So remapping involves using a map range node. So let's bring one of those in and just drop it into here. So what we're going to do is drag from the min and add a value, and also drag from the max and add a value. So I'm going to call the top one focal point and the bottom one depth. So basically we're going to have two controls, one of which is going to determine where the focus is, and the other is going to determine the depth of field. So I'm going to call this map range far because we're actually going to have two different maps, one for the front and one for the back. And to get our back, what we're going to do is we're going to add a math node to the depth, like this. So add is good. So we're just literally going to add the focal point to the depth. So I'm going to set my focal point at something like 21, and my depth I'm going to set to something like 150. So what are we looking at here? Anything that's grey in the background is going to be blurred. Anything that's black in the foreground is not going to be blurred. So we won't be able to see anything yet, but let's actually just quickly add a defocus node, which is what we're going to be using ultimately. What we want to do is take the image into it, and we want to take our far and pipe it into the Z. And we also want to set this Z scale to something like 150. So now if we look at our image, you'll see that the objects in the distance are blurred, but the foreground is not. So that's one part of it set up. Now we need to focus on the near. So I'm going to add another map range node, and I'm going to take my Z depth into it, obviously, because that's what we want to affect. And I'm going to take my focal point again into the min and my depth into the max. But what we want to do in this case, instead of adding the depth to the focal point, we want to subtract it from the focal point. So I'm going to drop in another math node, put it in there. Actually got that the wrong way around because the focal point wants to go into that top slot and the depth into the bottom value. And we need to switch it to subtract. So now if we look at this, you'll see we've got grey in the foreground, and if we use that as the Z input to the defocus and look at our result, you can see our foreground is blurred and not the background. So now what we need to do is we need to combine these two maps. So we can do that with another math node, and I'm just going to drop that in here, the far into the other value. I should call this new map range near, and this math node is going to be a maximum. So let's just have a look at that in the viewer, and you can see that the middle here is now black and the foreground and the background are grey. So if we look at our render, that's exactly what we've now got: a blurred background, a blurred foreground and an in focus middle ground. So that's a good start, but there are a couple of problems I want to point out. One of which is you'll see this sort of strange artifacting here, and that's very simply addressed. That's because we are in preview mode on the defocus tool. So if I come to the defocus, turn off preview, and we have another look, you'll see that artifacting has gone away. But there is another problem. If you look over here, this all looks nice, and the foreground blurs off into the middle ground, but you might just be able to see over here on the edge of this cube, it suddenly goes sharp before going blurred again. And over here, you can see we've got very sharp tops to the tops of this text here. So there is a very simple fix that I'm going to show you for this. So let's come back over here. What we're going to do is we're going to filter this near map. We're going to do it first of all with a dilate erode node. Drop that in there. I'm going to set that to something like 20. And then after that, I'm going to add a blur. And I'm going to drop that into here. And I'm going to set the X to something like 20 and the Y to something like 10. And if I just bypass that, you can see those sharp edges on the top of the H, for example. But if I re-enable that, we've expanded and blurred that edge. And if we look at our render, that's all looking much, much better now. We've probably slightly overcooked it. This is not looking quite right, but we can adjust that by fine-tuning this dilate erode value. Maybe go for something like 10. And let's have a look at that. And that's looking pretty good now. So what we can actually then do is we can use our focal point to choose different places to focus. So if I go for maybe sort of 6, you'll see that our foreground's in focus and our background is out. If we go for something like, I don't know, 33 for that, you can see that this big blur in the background is in focus, or should be. So let's have a look at that. Yeah, that's nicely in focus. And everything in front of it is out of focus. So it's all looking pretty good. And because we're using this nice defocus node, we're actually getting a nice bokeh effect. So I'm just going to switch this bokeh type to pentagonal, I think. And let's just focus back on the foreground and take a look. And you can see we've got these nice pentagon shaped bokeh effects in the background there. And we can always go for extra blur. So if we go for 32, take a look at that. You'll see we're getting larger out of focus bokeh in the back there. And that's looking all pretty nice. And of course, the final thing to point out, which I obviously should have examined earlier, is this depth slider. Because we've actually currently got very considerable depth of fields, because we've actually got grey and black rather than white and black. There's actually no white in the frame at all, and that's because the depth is so great. So if we reduce that to something like 20, and let's take another look at our render, you see that we've got much greater blur going on, and that's because we've got a much shallower depth of field. In fact, if you look at this text here, pretty much only this bit on the right here is in focus, and because of this angle, the left-hand side of the text is actually blurred already. So if you really want shallow depth of field, you can go for it. So anyway, I think that's a pretty useful rig and a lot of fun to play with. Hope it's been interesting. Thanks very much indeed for watching. See you again soon.